Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back. We're live at SUP-X, the Startup Expo, with Leon de Jerez. He's a partner at the SCA Group. Leon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. Maybe before we dive into what you guys are doing, let's get to know you a little bit better. Maybe give us a little background on yourself, kind of where you grew up, where you went to school, and kind of how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, for sure. Depends on how long you've got.
Sure.
So background is I grew up in Europe, multiple nationalities.
Very cool.
Worked in finance for 25 years as an activist investor, basically going into companies, trying to spot trends that we thought companies could take advantage of, but maybe hadn't spotted those trends yet.
Sure.
And then we went in and kind of did what we needed to do to make them successful. Parlayed that into direct ownership of companies, and which is what brought me over to the United States. And now I split my time between company ownership on the West Coast, which is in the media and digital content side.
Interesting.
And also strategic consultancy.
Okay, so what exactly is the SCA Group, and what do you guys do?
All right. So the SCA Group is a strategic consultancy. What we work with is basically in 4 silos, and we're probably best known for turnaround and restructuring. So two sides of the bankruptcy coin, if you will.
Sure.
We try not to take companies through bankruptcy just because essentially it's pain, but we will do it if we have to. And we're probably most well known for doing the Versace mansion down in Miami. We were the chief restructuring officer down there. The other 2 silos we work in are mergers and acquisitions and growth companies. So M&A, essentially, we don't replace banks or lawyers or anybody like that, but typically a lot of companies and mid-size and that don't have a lot of M&A expertise in-house. So we go in and provide that in-house expertise for them.
Very cool.
So that might be for a sale, preparing a company for a sale, for example, and taking it through the valuation process and the sale process. And on the buy side, it's everything from identifying targets right through to post-acquisition integration.
Interesting.
On growth, what we do is we help companies that have hit some sort of a roadblock. It can be financial. Maybe they need to help raise capital. We don't raise cap, but we help them find the right capital, structure the deals, etc. Might be finding them the right strategy, the right management team, the right tools they need to get, from 10 million to 25 million, from 25 million to 100, and so on and so forth.
Sure. Well, and I'm assuming you guys also help people, because obviously 10 million to, or from 0 to 10 million and then 10 million to 100 million or 20 million, you probably need different types of skill sets and different types of people. So how do you work with companies to manage that? Because that's tricky.
It is extremely tricky. And part of the problem is that for companies that are starting out in particular, they can get so caught up in the whole business of doing business that they actually don't tend to think about what is coming down the pike. And then they're scrambling to catch up, essentially. So, oftentimes that's when we're called in, and we're very often called in by capital or by the boards to come in and provide some expertise, or as Google would say, be the adult in the room, if you will.
Sure.
What we try and encourage, though, these companies, and we tend to drift in and out of these companies' lives as they reach each new stage. So, for example, one of our companies based down in Fort Lauderdale, we've been with them since they turned over $5 million, and this year they're going to clear 250.
Wow.
And we've taken them through about 30 acquisitions. So, but we've not been there constantly. We've come in and out as they've gone through each phase. But what we do in each of those is try and encourage them to think about what's next. We try and help the owners and the managers take that crucial step back and think about the next steps, not just like, let's make sales this month, or let's make payroll this month.
Well, yeah, and I would also assume that majority of probably the companies you work for have never gone through all the different stages, right? Where somebody like you guys have done it multiple times, so you could be like, do this, don't do that. So what advice do you kind of give people when they're going through those different stages? Are there kind of general things they need to think about it, or does it really depend on what they're doing?
Right, so that's a great question. And basically the answer kind of falls into 2 parts. On the one hand, we have basic skill sets, toolboxes, if you will, that we can give people and say, okay, you need to do this. At its most basic, something like managing a 13-week cash flow. Boring as hell, but without that, you can run out of money in a nanosecond or in 13 weeks. On the other hand, what we are able to do, which I think is less traditional, is because we work in multiple industries, we're able to help companies in one industry actually utilize tools that might be more useful in another industry. And say, okay, hang on, you need to kind of think about this. In healthcare, for example, one of my backgrounds is working with consumers, branding, etc.
Sure.
One of the big things in healthcare right now is patient engagement. Well, guess what? A lot of the skill sets that we use in the consumer industry will translate over into healthcare industry. They don't have that skill set. So that cross-silo ability is also incredibly key to our offering.
Right. Okay. So how do you actually start working with a company? Like, walk us through kind of the onboarding of a company.
I wish there was a basic way, because it really depends on the company. And a lot of companies are coming to us with a specific short-term need, and it's critical. So we have to adapt. Ideally, what we try and do when we have the time, and if they've come to us in time, is we start with a business assessment, which is essentially trying to understand how do they make their money. A lot of companies don't make money the way they think they make money, which is one of the more interesting outcomes. Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't think about it, but a lot of companies are logistics companies rather than product companies, for example, and things like that. So we start by identifying what are the key profit and cost touch points. And then we try and say, okay, what are your goals? What are your strategic goals? What are the tools you're going to need? And how do we bring them on? Not just what you need, but when you need it, and what's the runway to bringing those things on board.
Right. Okay. So how do you figure that out? Because it's got to be a little bit tricky, right? Because people are probably telling you, no, it's this.
Exactly.
You're like, no, it's that. And like, how do you bridge that gap between those?
Well, it's actually it's not a challenge when you're coming into a company that has a professional management team, because most managers have been trained in much the same way in this country, whether it's by an MBA or simply just work experience, right?
Sure, okay.
The bigger issue is when you come into a founder-CEO situation, because a founder-CEO will often have a vision, and they may be good at communicating that, and they may be they may think they're better at communicating it than they actually are.
Right.
And they think they also know everything there is to know about the company. So therefore, they're almost, even though they've brought you on board, although sometimes it's the board or the capitalist, I say, but even when they brought us on board, there can be that tension where they don't really want to be told anything about their own company, even though they've asked you to help them. So it is tricky.
Interesting. And I would also assume, like, it's all data, right? Like, data doesn't lie. It's like, this is costing you X amount of dollars a month, and then, but you're actually pulling in money over here.
Right.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say, well, it's all about the data is correct, except data can be manipulated and can be read in so many different ways. So you're right. And that's one of the big areas we do try and help with is data management. So how do you clean data? How do you understand what is the data you need? Well, let's start with basic. What do you need the data for? What data, therefore, are you going to collect, and how are you going to collect it? How are you going to access and analyze it? And how are you going to keep it secure? So those are the things we look at, because part of it is, okay, if we can get those answers done, we can actually build a framework where the data is helping guide us rather than either dictating us or misleading us.
But then how do you prove to them that the data you're showing them is actually the real thing and not kind of your own take on it, right?
Right. So one of the key things is to make sure the raw data is essentially correct. So that's the starting point of everything. And one of the guys we work with in our group, who's affiliated with our group, I should say, he describes himself, and I love this, as a data janitor, which actually, I love the term because it's slightly self-deprecating, but it explains exactly what he does. He cleans data. And that's the absolute starting point. So once we can get people to have confidence in the data set, then it's about asking the right questions. And that is, before we ask the questions, we spend a lot of time trying to understand, what are we trying to identify? Back to, what is the purpose of the data? And that's how we get the buy-in, by making them part of that process, not coming to them with a model, to your earlier point. We don't like, saying that this is how it's going to be, this is the, these are the questions. No, we want them to be part of that process, because you get the buy-in.
And then you can also prove, like, okay, well, you started here, now you're here, and like you can.
Correct. That's exactly right.
So walk us through that journey. Like, how do you decide when to recommend a company? Okay, you need like this role now, or maybe you need to tweak these people's roles, or you need to hire this, or like bring in somebody temporarily, right? Like you hear that all the time in the startup space. It's like you have like a temp CEO, or like you have bring in somebody just to like go to IPO, for example. So walk us through how you make those decisions.
So the biggest issue with any management team, whether they're temporary or whether they're the permanent team of that new company, is all growth companies rely on having some sort of an entrepreneurial spirit in them. Okay. That's really crucial, because that's what differentiates them, that's what drives them, it's what motivates a lot of the staff, why they join, because they don't want to work in a corporate environment. But the problem is, you do need some sort of a corporate imprint. So part of the issue that you have to work out is, okay, how do you intersect that in a way that doesn't destroy the entrepreneurial spirit, but actually still allows you to do what the company needs to do? So one of the first things we do is that business audit, essentially, that I was talking about earlier. We try and figure out, what does everybody bring to the party? And the other thing we look at it, there's a theory of constraints, essentially, which is we look at what are the things that constrain a company's ability to achieve something. And what that essentially, long story short, breaks down into is making sure that people are in the right position. And in a startup, you're aided by the fact that most people are doing everything, right?
Sure.
So you can utilize that to your benefit by saying, okay, this may be the HR director, but you know what? They have a really good eye for design. So they should be part of the whole creativity process, for example.
Sure.
So on and so forth. And so it's about asset utilization, identifying the right assets and utilizing them correctly. That's a big part of what we have to do, particularly with human capital.
Sure. And then I'm assuming, though, like if you're in your HR example, if they're good at it, but they don't want to do it, how do you kind of manage that until you could potentially hire somebody to like maybe take over that? Mentoring
is the way. We basically sell it to them as being mentors. In essence, we say, look, we're not going to make this part of your job. That's going to be Joe Smith's job over here. But Joe Smith could really use some guidance. You have a great eye for this kind of stuff. And we know you're worked off your ass right now. But, you know, what we'd like you to do is to spend 2-3 hours a week, just help guide, help mold, help this guy on his journey in this role. So we try and do it that way so that everybody can feel comfortable. Nobody feels they're taking on more responsibility than they need or want. So, yeah, a lot of it is horse trading, quite honestly.
No, fair enough. Yeah, because I could see you probably get some pushback sometimes.
For sure we get pushback.
Well, and then how do you get kind of the C-suite or upper management to buy into kind of the changes that you guys are suggesting?
Communication, pure and simple.
It is?
It has to be permanent communication. And in this day and age, thankfully, that is really a lot easier. Not only because there are, you know, the physical tools to do, like iPads, phones, etc., but now there are also suites out there as well, management suites, etc., that allow us to present information in a timely fashion, in a flexible fashion. And we can try and filter it so that we're also not bombarding people with information, because data overload is a big problem. We can burn people out by kind of just smothering them with data and goals.
So do you guys try to do as much in person or kind of remote or a bit of both, or how does that kind of work?
So that really depends on the company. We find that with younger startup companies, they are more comfortable in a flexible environment or in a kind of an open workspace environment. Older people typically want us to be physically present. So it's, I hate to say it, it's an age distinction more than anything else.
Interesting. But I also think, too, at least sometime in the process, you should meet people in person. It just seems to, like, go for dinner or just, like, do something that's not work-related, but you're still kind of like team building or whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, the old Thursday night is pizza night kind of thing. That's a great idea, but I think you need to, I agree with you, and I think you need to kind of like be more one-on-one with people as well. So, you know, maybe a longer answer to your earlier, or a more detailed answer to your earlier question is, we tend to, at the start, we're much more focused on the personal side of it, even if it's a remote type of setup. And that might require us to travel to different places. But we do try and get to know people. As we've gotten to know them and as we start to roll out the program, we can take that step back. And we don't have to be so in your face, like at an individual level.
Talk quarterly or something, or whatever that is.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, though, when you guys recommend bringing in somebody, do you actually find that person? Do you have somebody on staff, or do you start the recruitment process?
So again, it's a movable feast. In many instances, if it's a C-suite position, typically we're asked to occupy it. So we're often asked to be the CEO, temporary CFO of these companies to help them get through whatever that problem is, right? More often than not, though, even when that's the case, we are helping them find the right full-time replacement and then train that replacement, make sure that they are aware of what's necessary, etc. We work with a lot of service providers. We know who's good. We know who's less good. And we try and also match the service provider philosophically or culturally with the companies we're working for, so that it's a good fit. And you haven't got, like, you know, a real, you know, white shoe banker working for a real young startup, and the two just can't communicate.
No, that makes sense. But usually in that case, just to your example right there, it's like you usually need somebody that's a bit older with some experience to be a CEO or kind of some C-level suite. But then how do you bridge that gap between like the younger generation that's a little bit more kind of startup-y, Wild Westy, right? Because like I think
are you trying to say old people can't be hip?
No. It's just like I think the perfect example is like Google brought in
Schmidt.
Yeah, right. And he clearly did a good job there.
Yeah.
And then he was only there for a decade or so,
But I think that actually works only when you can get a personal connection between the founders, the early founders, and the managers. I think things break down into two camps. You've got the founders who are hands-on, love to kind of get dirty with the product. In IT, all they really want to do is code.
Yeah, fair.
So, one of the things Eric Schmidt did that was very smart, apart from figure out the whole business model, was he understood that the two founders really just wanted to be kind of creative, doing their own things. They didn't want to deal with the management of the company.
Sure.
So he did that. That model, I think, is very transferable outside of IT as well. So you've got to figure out what is it the founders really want to do, help them achieve that. And if it's to manage the company, simply give them the support to do that. If it's to do whatever the thing is they want to do, then you have to provide maybe a bigger solution on the management side.
Sure. And I guess it's just understanding where the other person is coming from, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
And then do you guys kind of mediate those conversations, or how does that work?
So first of all, we're very, very careful about which partner we put in. We are not at all, we don't take ownership. Like if we've gone out to win a client, if we just can't really, click with that client, or it's clearly not really, I think we'll look in the partnership to find the person who can. That's number one. I think number two on it is that what we try and make sure is that the overarching goals are aligned between everybody who's involved in the process. And so consequently, what we try and do is make sure that the founders are very clear up front with what is it they want to achieve. And then we will orient ourselves around that to make sure we have the right people plugged in at the right time to help them do that.
Sure. No, that's quite interesting. So do you guys try to stick in a single vertical or a few verticals, or how does that kind of work?
So we work in most verticals. I guess, the one of the verticals we'll absolutely not get into is banking, just because of the regulatory environment. There are a couple of others which we tend to avoid, but on the whole, we've got, within the partnership, we have deep skill sets in virtually every single industry. So I guess the other answer to that question is we actually like the fact that we have multiple industry experience because of that illustration I made, or example I gave you earlier, bringing those skill sets from another industry into one that hasn't necessarily experienced them yet.
It is interesting how a lot of people just they're like, well, that's not in my industry. It's like, yeah, but business is business, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
and businesses have people, and people are people. So it's kind of like, well, the skills, the industry almost doesn't matter in probably a lot of cases. It's like, if you have an accounting problem, well, everybody has that, right?
Yeah, we should hire you for marketing. That's what we try and tell everybody. Not everybody buys into that argument. And there is, of course, there are some phenomenal consulting groups out there that are very industry specific. And we don't want to take away from that. I think what it really boils down to is size of company and what actually is the issue. If the issue is you've got something really technological on an assembly line that needs dealing with, we're probably not your guys.
Got you.
But if you've got something that's more strategic oriented or financially oriented or things like that, we can help them much more than sometimes somebody who's very narrow focused, because we can slot it in a broader industry picture, essentially.
Right. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. So where do you kind of see the future of work going? Do you think everything's going to go digital? Do you think everything's getting replaced by software or artificial intelligence? Like, what's your prediction on that?
So I think that there's always going to be a mix between technology and human. I think that it's just going to be because I'll give you an example in healthcare. So right now, for example, although there are care bots that exist, there are chat bots that exist, telehealth exists, the reality is people want to combine it with a human interaction, particularly with health. I think with things that are technology-oriented, generally people are more comfortable allowing technology to take the lead because it somehow fits. So for example, even self-driving cars, I think people will ultimately accept that kind of technology taking the lead. With healthcare, because it is so personal, for example, even though AI may eventually be much better than humankind at diagnosing, I think people still need that human interaction, that sense of comfort, that sense of empathy.
Yeah, fair, because you can't really get that from a machine.
You can't. Maybe they'll code it, but I doubt it.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, like a simple example is like a algorithm or computer can go through, say, like 1,000 x-rays clearly faster than a human being.
Right.
And if they point out a handful of a human being needs to review because there's it's different, or something's wrong.
Right.
then I think like that's a simple example of it's like, okay, well, if you can speed things up,
right,
give something better and basically say like, okay, somebody physical has to go through and look at this, then that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely,
right?
and I think that's it. You know, AI and machine learning particularly are best suited to tasks that are really highly repetitive and are similar. Very quickly, because I know of time, but you know, a good example here is you mentioned imaging and diagnosis. Well, one of the fascinating things is IBM Watson, which is other than DeepMind, probably the lodestar in terms of AI, failed disastrously on diagnosing oncology. That was last year, and IBM had to come up and say, yeah, it couldn't do it. It failed to identify correctly, and it failed to give a proper diagnosis. But on that was because it was too broad. It gave it too wide a field. But on a narrow field, like eye disease, for example, we've just had cleared. I don't know if you know this, but IDX has gotten FDA approval for the first artificial intelligence guided diagnosis machine, which means no human interaction at all.
Wow.
So, but it's very specific, and it's something that is a very common problem with the same symptoms, highly repeatable common symptoms. AI copes very well with that. So I think we're a ways away from passing the Turing test on this, but I think, in very repetitive tasks, easily and narrowly defined tasks, I think AI in the short term and certainly medium term has a really bright future. But I think humans are around at least for a little bit longer.
No, fair enough. But sadly, we're out of time.
No, thank you so much. It was really nice to meet you. And
but let's close with mentioning where people can get more information about you.
Okay, so we can go to our website, which is the SCA Group LLC.com, or you can just look me up on LinkedIn, and that will link you to our website. And failing that, just drop me an email.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for doing it. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.